bem-vindos a mais uma sessão do Encontro Ciência 21. Esta sessão é dedicada ao tema Ciência Urbana e Cidades para o Futuro. Temos 5 intervenções previstas, as quais cada uma terá 10 minutos para a apresentação e depois teremos um espaço de debate. E, previamente às apresentações, como, enfim, se tornou modelo neste encontro, e acho que foi uma excelente iniciativa, temos aqui connosco um grupo de estudantes peço desculpa, eu devia ter-me apresentado primeiro. Meu nome é Maria do Rosário Partidário, eu sou professora catedrática no Instituto Superior Técnico, na área de Planeamento, Urbanismo e Ambiente. E dizia, portanto, que temos aqui uma abertura de jovens do agrupamento de escolas de Camarate, que nos vêm trazer 3 minutos de, enfim, ciência na perspectiva deles, da sua experiência. Eles são de um projeto que é os Climate Detectives e, portanto, dou a palavra ao João, que vai falar em nome dos colegas.
Boa tarde. E agora agradeço a palavra. Bem, o meu nome é João Bernardo Vieira, eu sou aluno na Escola Básica de Camarate, que está inserida no agrupamento de escolas de Camarate. E a escola, graças ao E0, teve a iniciativa de participar num projeto de detetives do clima. Este projeto, para nós, teve como motivo o facto de estarmos a 2 km do aeroporto de Lisboa, um aeroporto que é muito falado e conhecido nacionalmente, e o que nos, digamos assim, classificou melhor e nos fez avançar com este projeto foi o facto de, perante 2019, onde estávamos numa situação normal, digamos assim, entre aspas, as escolas, tanto perto do aeroporto, consequentemente, cada dia e cada hora, quase, digamos assim, passava aviões e acabava por perturbar as aulas e entre outras coisas. E em 2020 isso não aconteceu. Entramos em situação pandémica, fomos todos confinados, como todos aqui presentes, devido ao Covid-19, e todos passámos a ter aulas online. Consequentemente, os aviões deixaram de existir em grande quantidade e diminuiu, deixando de existir assim grande barulho. Os professores notaram nisso e acabaram por abordar os alunos nesse tema e falar um pouco sobre isso durante as aulas. E foi aí que começou esta iniciativa que as professoras tomaram. Nós falámos com cientistas, a cientista Ana Barros, que está presente hoje em dia na Alemanha, e observámos certas reportagens, entre outras coisas que nos levaram a pesquisar melhor. Utilizámos o programa EOBrowser, um programa da ESA. Não, mentira, peço desculpa. Um programa EOBrowser que nos ajudou muito através do Sentinel-5P. Inicialmente, os próprios alunos tiveram a ideia de pesquisar o dióxido de carbono, o dióxido de enxofre e o dióxido de nitrogênio. Mas, consequentemente, notámos que não era bem as partículas que queríamos observar, que provinham da poluição dos aviões, e acabámos por observar o PM10 e o dióxido de nitrogênio. Foi as partículas que nos realçou melhor e que nos deu mais motivação para o fazer. Consequentemente, através do browser e de sensores que estavam instalados no local do terreno, neste caso no chão, em Camarate, conseguimos comparar os dados do dióxido de nitrogênio e do PM10. Esses dados foram coerentes com as nossas, digamos assim, hipóteses, nossas sugestões, aquilo que já estávamos à espera que acontecesse, e houve uma diminuição significativa de 2019, onde estava normal, uma circulação normal, maiores viagens, mais aviões que facilitaram os meios de transporte aéreos, do que em 2020, quando estávamos em situação pandémica. Então, nesse caso, acabámos por ficar com uma dúvida que muito provavelmente vai ser o tema de um trabalho próximo, muito recentemente, esperemos estar cá para o ano, que é uma falha que nos aconteceu. Não se trata nada menos do que, em 2020, nós não conseguimos observar a poluição que é feita através dos transportes públicos e até mesmo privados, carros, barcos, entre outras coisas. Conseguimos ter a certeza que a poluição que em Camarate não provém de fábricas, devido ao facto da indústria em Camarate ser muito reduzida, algo que devia de ser melhorado. Mas é algo que nos acabou por facilitar e melhorar o nosso entusiasmo. Eu gostei muito desta experiência e espero que para o ano esteja cá outra vez com mais projetos. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada a todos por terem estado aqui conosco. Parabéns pela experiência. É bom que comecem cedo, porque de facto é preciso começar cedo para conseguirmos alinhar melhor este desenvolvimento das cidades com a qualidade de vida e a qualidade ambiental que se pretende. E, por um lado, foi uma sorte o Covid, não é? E a redução dos voos, porque permitiu ter aqui um período de contraste entre aquilo que é uma situação de grande tráfego, não é? E uma de tráfego bastante menor e que, enfim, torna, se alguém tinha dúvidas, ficou esclarecido. Não é? Muito obrigada. Se quiserem ficar connosco, podem se sentar. Pronto, vamos então... enfim, eu não perguntei se alguém tem alguma questão que queira dirigir a este grupo de alunos, mas se tivessem, certamente já teriam dito. Pronto, vamos então iniciar agora a apresentação dos 5 oradores. Eu aproveito para dizer que a sessão irá terminar cerca das... portanto, 4h30... Não, 5h10, exatamente, 5h10, 5h15, não é? Porque disseram-me justamente para compensar o período de atraso. A sessão seguinte, plenária, é às 5h30 e, portanto, desde que saiamos daqui 5h15, o que é suficiente. E, portanto, eu vou sugerir que vou chamar pela ordem que eu tenho aqui no programa. Vou só dizer o vosso nome e a instituição de onde vêm, depois se quiserem dizer alguma coisa mais sobre vós, podem dizer, mas já é dentro dos 10 minutos, ok? E isso eu só vou ser um bocadinho rígida com os 10 minutos, justamente para podermos ter tempo depois no final para discutir, ok? Pronto. E, portanto, vou começar por chamar ou convidar a vir falar a Maria Manuela Silva Pires Silva, do Centro de Química da Universidade do Minho, que nos traz um tema muito interessante sobre janelas sustentáveis para edifícios com eficiência energética. Então, Maria Manuela, 10 minutos, por favor. Precisa de ajuda aí? Ou...
Não, acho que consigo encontrar a Thalia.
Não sei se alguém pode ir ajudar, eu não sou...
Não, acho que não está a abrir.
FCT.
Sim, acho que...
Muito bem.
Ora,
então...
muito boa tarde e muito obrigada pela introdução. Conseguem-me ouvir bem? Sim? Pronto.
Capaz de ser melhor aproximar-se um bocadinho do microfone, por causa também da gravação.
Com a máscara é complicado. Ora, muito boa tarde. Eu hoje vou tentar aqui falar um bocadinho nestes 10 minutos do trabalho que desenvolvo há alguns anos no Departamento de Química, Centro de Química da Universidade do Minho. E o meu objetivo e a minha motivação para este estudo prende-se com o facto de os edifícios são um ponto muito importante no setor económico, nomeadamente na quantidade de energia que gastamos para arrefecer os edifícios, para aquecer e a própria luz artificial que nós possamos usar. Só a título de curiosidade, por exemplo, em 2010, a União Europeia gastou cerca de 40% da energia em edifícios. Vou-vos só mostrar aqui um pequeno filme que se calhar não vou colocar todo para não gastar tanto tempo, mas é fundamentalmente isto que é o motivo da minha investigação. O poder fazer janelas dinâmicas. Portanto, e aproveitar ao máximo a energia do sol. Okay. Portanto, ou seja, o que é que eu quero dizer com isto? Se eu quiser construir uma janela ideal, eu tenho ali representado, por exemplo, umas temperaturas baixas e umas temperaturas elevadas. Ou seja, para as temperaturas ou para um dia quente, o ideal numa janela será a luz solar, quando incide, conseguir a luz visível atravessar a janela e a luz do infravermelho ser refletida. Isto para quê? Para que a temperatura no seu interior não seja demasiado elevada. E o contrário se passará num clima ou numa temperatura mais fria. Portanto, onde aí eu já quero que a radiação visível e a radiação infravermelha passe a janela. Portanto, isto é o ideal, certo? E o meu objetivo é ter uma temperatura o mais ideal possível para que nós consigamos estar confortáveis e com a mesma visibilidade que eu sempre tenho quando uso, então, um vidro nas minhas janelas. Obviamente que este trabalho está inserido nos objetivos do desenvolvimento sustentável das Nações Unidas. E como é que eu consigo isso? Eu já trabalho com esta tecnologia há alguns anos, certo? O meu foco é, em especial, o eletrólito polimérico, que depois eu já vos vou explicar, porque esta audiência provavelmente não é muito ligada à química e, portanto, posso estar aqui a falar em alguns conceitos um bocadinho mais estranhos, mas eu vou tentar falar numa linguagem muito simples. Portanto, eu desenvolvo, então, eletrólitos totalmente sólidos, porque os líquidos já são aplicados nesta tecnologia. E porquê é que eu uso os eletrólitos totalmente sólidos? Para ter algumas vantagens a nível ambiental e a nível de segurança. Estes eletrólitos, além destes dispositivos eletrocrómicos que podem ser aplicados em janelas sustentáveis, eles também podem ser aplicados em baterias, uma vez que são eletrólitos. Qual é então a vantagem destes eletrólitos? Eu posso ter variadíssimas formas, eu posso aplicar estes eletrólitos quer em vidros para as janelas, quer em superfícies flexíveis. A estrutura a nível tecnológico e a nível industrial é simplificado, porque estes eletrólitos funcionam como colantes, eles colam e, portanto, podemos economizar aí algumas das componentes que selam a própria célula, e temos os problemas a nível da segurança dos produtos e do ambiente. Estes eletrólitos, o que é que são? São conseguidos fazer à custa de macromoléculas naturais, e eu estou aqui só a dar 2 exemplos, como, por exemplo, o quitosano, a seda, a celulose, o DNA, o próprio DNA que possamos extrair de desperdícios, por exemplo, de peixe, que é uma macromolécula, um polímero. Portanto, eu posso usar estas macromoléculas naturais, e a estas macromoléculas naturais tenho que adicionar sais. Para quê? Para conferir uma determinada condutividade ao material.
2 minutos.
Ok. O processo é muito simples em termos de produção e usa solventes como a água, portanto, são extremamente simples, e ali está o tal dispositivo eletrocrómico que pode ser aplicado numa janela. Portanto, temos os vidros e depois temos, é como se fosse uma sanduíche, ok? Com as vários layers, e aquele que está ali a amarelinho, que é o tal eletrólito sólido, ok? Muito rapidamente, para terminar, portanto, isto é aquilo que eu identifiquei como a janela ideal. É um protótipo já que foi feito no meu laboratório, onde podemos ter materiais que são transparentes na zona do visível e também do infravermelho, e, mais importante ainda, podermos adicionar sais com capacidade de absorção da radiação visível e ultravioleta, infravermelha, desculpem, e conseguir jogar com estas funcionalidades destes sais. Só mesmo também para terminar, eu tenho aqui um protótipozinho onde se vê a colorir e a descolorir a janela, porque o objetivo é podermos fazer o escurecimento ou o clareamento da janela. Ok? Portanto, só para terminar, estes materiais são estáveis eletroquimicamente, são estáveis termicamente, têm uma condutividade aceitável e são grandes promissores para aplicar em janelas sustentáveis. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada. Não sei se alguém tem alguma questão, por favor. Sim?
Eu gostava de saber até que ponto é que a tecnologia que esteve disponível desde os anos que está comercializada e acessível ao público em geral, e se sim, a um preço módico, a um preço acessível.
É possível, porque, portanto, a produção destas membranas já existem, essa produção tecnologicamente obtida pelo método Dr. Bland. Portanto, ou seja, eu posso fazer as películas destes eletrólitos perfeitamente a nível industrial. Em termos de preços, é barato. Não sei precisar o valor, mas estamos a falar de polímeros bastante acessíveis, existem na natureza. Eu já tenho protótipos, por exemplo, com a gelatina, que há aqui tanta juventude que gosta da gelatina. A própria gelatina faz um filme importante para estas aplicações. Os solventes também é água, portanto não é nada de nem mau para o ambiente, nem caro em termos de confecção, e é extremamente simples.
Mas já está a ser comercializado?
Ainda não.
Não,
Aqui,
pronto.
vamos lá ver. Já existem alguns edifícios com esta tecnologia, não em Portugal. Ainda é uma tecnologia relativamente cara, porque o que eu estou aqui a tentar substituir é os polímeros sintéticos por naturais e fazer a tecnologia muito mais barata.
E, portanto, os edifícios sustentáveis que já existem em Portugal ainda não adotaram essa tecnologia?
Ainda não.
Muito bem. Muito obrigada. Não sei se há assim mais alguma. Premente, não havendo, quero agradecer mais uma vez pela apresentação e pela partilha da informação e do conhecimento que nos trouxe. Até na perspectiva química, que do ponto de vista do planeamento e urbanismo é diferente, naturalmente, mas é interessante e voltaremos ao assunto, espero, na discussão. E convido agora o colega, enfim, desculpe, não sei se é professor, investigador, doutor, arquiteto, engenheiro, mas depois poderá dizer... Só não é mesmo engenheiro. O resto é tudo. Pronto. Alberto Reais Pinto, que é do Centro de Investigação em Território, Arquitetura e Design. Enfim, já terá bastante experiência pela idade, que obviamente está bastante bem, e que nos vai falar de habitação modular evolutiva. Não sei se já vem com os polímeros nas janelas ou não, e adaptação das janelas à orientação solar, mas a sua apresentação será sobre desconstrução e desmantelamento seletivo. E, portanto, mais uma vez, são 10 minutos. Eu, quando levanto este cartão, é porque faltam 4 minutos, mas depois leva um tempo a olhar, o tempo passa, não é? E, portanto, quando eu levantar o cartão, é porque faltam 4 minutos. Obrigada.
Tem que ter aí para a gente passar.
Ok. Pronto, é como deram-me instruções.
Boa tarde a todos. Eu ia ler, que é muito desagradável, mas se falo, não chego nem a metade. De maneira que passo a ler. Este trabalho é feito com a colaboração da bolseira de investigação, a arquiteta Rita Ferreira, aqui presente. A nossa apresentação foca-se no trabalho desenvolvido no projeto de investigação, desconstrução e desmantelamento seletivo, caso de estudo de habitação modular evolutiva. Os edifícios são responsáveis nas fases de construção, exploração e demolição por grandes impactos ambientais negativos, resultantes fundamentalmente do consumo excessivo de energias fósseis, da significativa utilização sem critério de materiais com muita energia incorporada e da grande produção de resíduos, nomeadamente os que têm origem na demolição. A demolição no fim do ciclo de vida dos edifícios leva ao transporte dos materiais a vazador, num processo de produção linear de esgotamento da utilização desses materiais. Resulta ainda na ocupação do espaço no território e tem como consequência a reação química desses materiais e a contaminação dos níveis freáticos e das espécies vegetais e animais. Neste sentido, considera-se muito importante a substituição do processo de demolição dos edifícios pela sua desconstrução e desmantelamento seletivo, e é nesse âmbito que desenvolvemos o projeto de investigação, desconstrução e desmantelamento seletivo, habitação modular evolutiva. No contexto atual, as zonas do interior do país vão se diversificando lentamente pelo êxodo das suas populações para outros lugares com ofertas melhores de vida, pela não utilização dos seus recursos naturais ou pelo seu esgotamento, sem capacidade da criação de uma dinâmica própria que possa atrair as suas populações. É necessário desenvolver condições para que se sintam bem, para que possam encontrar mais oportunidades quanto à habitação. Pretende-se que a realização desta unidade habitacional possa permitir uma construção crescente ao longo do tempo, segundo as condições económicas e o crescimento da família, no âmbito dos princípios da construção sustentável. Considera-se na construção e exploração, na sua construção e exploração, a utilização de materiais sustentáveis, de preferência locais, que possam ser integrados numa economia circular. Esta habitação é constituída por 2 módulos, o módulo A, com funções diurnas, de tipologia T0 e o módulo B acrescente de tipologia inicial T1 com funções noturnas. A tipologia deste módulo pode partir de um T1 e evoluir para uma tipologia de mais quartos. Considera-se que dentro dos princípios da construção sustentável e da economia circular, esta habitação possa ser desconstruída e desmantelada seletivamente, o que exige que o projeto deste edifício seja concebido e realizado no sentido da sua reversibilidade. A reciclagem e a reutilização dos materiais que a integram viabilizam o aumento da sua duração e dos seus sistemas construtivos no fim do ciclo de vida do edifício. Este projeto de investigação respeita, por isso, alguns princípios que potenciam a desconstrução e desmantelamento seletiva do edifício. Utiliza a construção modular, reduz o tipo de materiais, usa materiais recicláveis e reutilizáveis, usa tecnologias construtivas adequadas à desconstrução, separa os materiais do revestimento da estrutura, privilegia as ligações mecânicas a seco das ligações coladas, utiliza componentes para serem executados manualmente. Para a construção desta habitação, tem em especial certificado os blocos de encaixe de baixo carbono, podendo ser feitos no local da obra, manualmente, em moldes de madeira, e utilizados nas paredes exteriores da habitação, utilizando na sua construção a cal hidráulica como aglomerante e aglomerados com elevado nível de isolamento térmico, como granos de cortiça e a palha, ou casca de arroz, ou bagaço de azeitona, etc, etc. Os blocos foram ensaiados com bons resultados à resistência mecânica e ao isolamento térmico. O edifício é só de um piso, de estrutura de paredes exteriores resistentes, constituídos por blocos de encaixe e reforçados nos cantos do edifício com cantoneiras metálicas verticais LNP 80.8, aparafusados às paredes e soldados a uma cinta metálica horizontal com o mesmo perfil na parte superior da parede. As fundações são diretas, contínuas, constituídas com pedra local e argamassa de assentamento de cal hidráulica. O pavimento obedece a uma estrutura de vigas de madeira tarugadas, apoiadas em freixais assentes nas paredes das fundações, com tabuleiro de placas de derivados de madeira, tipo OSB, pregadas a serrafos, entre barrotes, para assentamento das placas de isolamento térmico de lã de rocha, com espessura da ordem dos 10 cm. O revestimento do soalho é de madeira de pinho, pregado diretamente sobre as vigas de madeira, formando caixa de ar com pavimento térreo de terra batida. Os circuitos das instruções técnicas serão otimizados no sentido da redução das respectivas redes, do seu funcionamento, prevendo a manutenção e da sua recuperação parcial ou da sua reciclagem. Para as paredes exteriores, o desenho do bloco, nomeadamente do seu sistema de encaixe, facilita o alinhamento e a maior resistência dos blocos na construção de paredes exteriores, para além da economia obtida na argamassa de assentamento, que se pretende que seja reversível e que é colocada apenas perifericamente dos dois lados do bloco. A interrupção dessa argamassa resulta do desenho dos blocos, que na sua zona de assentamento tem um sistema de encaixe com uma espessura, com uma pequena caixa de ar que interrompe a transmissão higrotérmica através da argamassa. A parede pode ainda ser construída sem argamassa de assentamento entre blocos, sendo neste caso reforçada espaçadamente por pequenos esforços verticais. Quanto às paredes interiores, podem ser construídas numa carpintaria local e são constituídas por uma estrutura de módulos de madeira de pinho, interligados por fixação mecânica, com preenchimento de material de isolamento acústico, de lã, de rocha, com espessura de 8 cm. Considera-se a solução da cobertura inclinada com estrutura de barrotes de madeira, constituída por revestimento exterior de telhas cerâmicas planas, de baixa inclinação, formando uma caixa de ar com revestimento interior do teto, constituído por placas de gesso cartonado ou por tábuas de madeira à vista, fixadas por baixo da estrutura de madeira e que poderão também ser fixadas sobre as vigas de madeira que ficarão à vista. No isolamento térmico da caixa de ar, está utilizada a lã de rocha com a espessura da ordem dos 10 cm. Os revestimentos das paredes exteriores, de várias tipologias, são geralmente construídos previamente fora do local da construção e constituídos por painéis de revestimento com uma estrutura própria que são fixados mecanicamente sobre uma estrutura existente na parede exterior. Essa fixação a seco, desligada do suporte rígido, permite a obtenção de uma aplicação mais rápida dos acabamentos, com aumento de produtividade e redução dos resíduos no local de trabalho, e viabiliza a reutilização dos painéis de revestimento no fim do ciclo de vida do edifício. O crescimento económico com base no carbono e no carbono equivalente, na utilização de combustíveis fósseis que dão origem a gases de efeito de estufa, aquecimento global e mudanças climáticas, foi determinante na crise ambiental global atual, agravada pelo desperdício de recursos materiais naturais, particularmente resultantes do crescimento da indústria da construção, com a produção excessiva de resíduos de demolição a nível mundial. A desconstrução e o desmantelamento seletivo com a triagem e a reciclagem, pretendem a recuperação e a obtenção do máximo de materiais e de elementos que constituem as diferentes partes dos edifícios no fim do seu ciclo de vida. Esta recuperação é realizada no sentido de que estes materiais possam ser utilizados na construção de novos edifícios por processos de reutilização e de reciclagem, reduzindo assim os impactos ambientais negativos resultantes da sua exploração, extração das matérias-primas, fabrico e da produção de resíduos. O desmantelamento seletivo, mais moroso do que a demolição convencional, otimiza a recuperação e a reciclagem dos materiais e exige, segundo Charles Kibert, que a montante no projeto de execução sejam respeitados alguns princípios no sentido de potenciar a desconstrução do edifício. Neste trabalho, consideramos para a desconstrução do edifício, habitação modular e evolutiva, as seguintes ações de desmantelamento seletivo. Recuperação de um manejo geral de todos os elementos, no todo ou em parte, que possam ser reutilizados com o mínimo de adaptações possíveis. Recuperação dos elementos de equipamento, de louças sanitárias, torneiras e de infraestruturas de água, esgotos, eletricidade, etc. Recuperação de portas e aduelas das paredes interiores de madeira e revestimentos. Desmontagem das coberturas com placas de celas, como as placas de celas fotovoltaicas e de elementos salientes como chaminés, condutas de ventilação, capeamento de muretes, cadeiras e revestimentos da cobertura. Recuperação de caixinhas de janelas, torres, peitorias e portas exteriores, soleiras e peças de guarnição dos vãos. Recuperação das placas de revestimento das paredes exteriores. Desmontagem das cantoneiras metálicas, de confinamento da estrutura de parede resistente. Desmontagem dos blocos de encaixe das paredes exteriores. Da recuperação das fundações. A indústria da construção tem contribuído muito significativamente para elevados impactos negativos ambientais e a construção de edifícios, em particular, é responsável, para além da utilização de grandes quantidades de materiais não renováveis, com grande incorporação de combustíveis fósseis, pela produção excessiva de resíduos provenientes da construção e demolição. Tem um consumo de recursos naturais da ordem dos 40% a 50%, de energia de pelo menos 40%, e tem uma produção de resíduos de 40% a 50% também. A escolha com critério dos materiais e da sua aplicação no âmbito da construção sustentável, no sentido da sua reversibilidade, da menor incorporação de combustíveis fósseis, da sua reciclagem e reutilização, no fim do ciclo de vida dos edifícios, onde são incorporados, reduz esses impactos. Para a maior redução dos resíduos de construção e demolição, entende-se necessário que, para além de um projeto inicial do edifício, se tenha, em paralelo, um projeto de construção e desmantelamento seletivo, no sentido da reciclagem e reutilização dos materiais que integram o edifício, prolongando a sua vida útil, dando origem a novos materiais, integrando-os numa economia circular e reduzindo os impactos ambientais negativos que esta indústria produz. Obrigado pela atenção e desculpem que isto foi um bocado a correr, porque 10 minutos...
Mas ainda bem, porque bateu mesmo na hora certa. Obrigada. Muito obrigada pelo esforço para cumprir com o tempo. Mais uma vez pergunto se há alguma pergunta que queiram colocar. Desde já, ou se esperamos pela discussão. Está visto que os nossos alunos de camarada está na hora de se irem embora. Eu, por acaso, só tinha uma muito rápida, que é relativamente ao custo de recuperação de todos estes materiais. Ou seja, se o custo de recuperação, porque fala, não é? Sim.
Para já, os custos não podem ser interpretados como custos à partida, são sempre custos relacionados com o ciclo de qualidade de vida dos utilizadores e dos edifícios. Portanto, os custos, há custos, mas os custos são diferentes de partir do edifício todo, do alvazador com os problemas que tem, ou aproveitar os materiais, utilizá-los, reciclá-los, e a partir do projetista tem que saber que ao elencar ou escolher os materiais, eles têm que ser recicláveis e reutilizáveis. Portanto, ao escolher um material que pode dar origem a outros materiais diferentes, a arquitetura e a construção tem que ser menos extrativa, mais circular, aproveitando mais os materiais, com a sua reutilização, a reciclagem, mas há problemas que são fundamentais. Nós estamos a atravessar uma crise violentíssima, não temos bem consciência, que é realmente um crescimento económico à base do carbono que desequilibra os dois pilares da construção sustentável, da desenvolvimento sustentável.
Sim, mas já me respondeu. Obrigada. Pronto. Obrigada. Muito bem. Então passamos a... Okay, this is where I shift the language into English so that I can welcome Ian Scott. Otherwise, he will be speaking in English anyway. So Ian is coming from the Nova Cidade Urban Analytics Lab from Nova IMS, Information Management Systems. He provides here a title in Portuguese, which I will read, or maybe there. B2 Waste Crypto, bringing trust and transparency to the opaque world of waste management. Wow, okay, an application of a parachain-based blockchain. I'm very curious. So in 10 minutes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So yes, my name's Ian and I'm a postdoc in the Urban Analytics Lab at Nova IMS. And this is a CMU Portugal program research project called B2 Waste Crypto, where we partner with CMU, 3Drivers, FutureCompta, and Technico. And as the title, that long title tells you, we're going to be looking at the application of blockchain in waste management. So I think we all know we have a problem with waste in society. This is kind of obvious, but it is worth keeping in mind the scale of this problem is really huge. For example, every minute, a garbage truck-sized quantity of plastic waste is added to the ocean. So this is obviously a really big problem. And what's kind of tragic about this is it doesn't need to be this way. We have technology to recycle a lot of plastic products. So the EU is reasonably focused on this issue and aware of it, and we see here different recycling rates for different European nations. And the European Union has set quite ambitious targets for 2020 and 2030, but we see a number of these countries, including Portugal, are really pretty far away from achieving those targets. It's also the case that even once we introduce recycling material or waste to the kind of waste management system, we still have a number of problems. This map shows you the proportion of hazardous waste material, once it enters the waste management system, just goes missing, or is basically illegally disposed of. And you can see in a number of countries, this is 50%. This is really high, a big problem. So we're basically interested in technological solutions to these problems, and particularly in the area of municipal waste or household waste. And this is actually considered a very complex waste management stream just because of the diversity of different types of products we put into our waste at home. And really the only way to deal with it is to have us separating waste at home into different categories. There's lots of reasons in the literature people do or don't separate their recycling, but we're particularly interested in here around questions of incentives to do so and trust. And in general, waste management is sort of this low trust environment where we don't always find people trust if they put their recycling they separate their recycling, if that will actually end up recycled. So one approach to this problem we can look at is in technology adoption modeling. And this is kind of a complex diagram, but basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify what factors will help us explain people's behavioral intention to use a waste management technology, their actual use of that waste management technology, and their intention to recommend that technology to others. And basically what we do is we look at different features we could add to a waste management technology, like gamification, increasing trust, and adding economic incentives. And we find that kind of all of these help encourage people to use waste management technologies and separate their recycling. So with those kind of adoption drivers in mind, we can look at blockchain technology. So blockchain technology is kind of designed to provide trust and transparency. And it's sometimes referred to as the Internet of Trust. And what we probably know blockchain from is, for example, Bitcoin, where people trust blockchain to transfer vast quantities of vast values of money. And so we know we can use blockchain to apply financial incentives and provide payments to people. Blockchain is also used increasingly in gamification and gaming, but we're not too interested in that detail here. So basically what we're looking at is a blockchain system that helps incentivize people to recycle. So what it looks like is basically we have a user at home and they receive different colored bags for separating their recycling into different types of recycling. And those bags are actually tracked in some way, either with RFIDs or with QR codes. And basically we register those bags to the blockchain. And what happens is you, as a user, you deposit your recycling in a deposit point as usual, and that is registered again to the blockchain. The same when someone collects the waste, that is registered to the blockchain. And finally, when it ends up at sorting and recycling facilities, again, we register that action to the blockchain. And what's particularly important in this case is we can provide a quality rating. We can check how well do people actually separate their different recycling products. Then finally, these sorting facilities package up all the recycled material to be on-sold, and we can kind of register that, and you can see how much of the recycling you produce actually gets sold and the value that that is sold for. So that allows us at home to see what's happening to our recycling, add some transparency, but it also allows the local municipality to really track what's happening. So they don't just see what's happening overall in terms of how much waste is being produced, but they can see each individual, how much waste are you producing and how much recycling are you producing. And what that allows them to do is to set the costs for your waste production, and also allows them to introduce rewards for recycling. So we can pay these through the blockchain as rewards for recycling performance, which then can be used locally in local businesses or to pay sort of fees at the local municipality, pay your bills, and basically all of this is tracked in the blockchain. So just to talk a little bit about the details of this blockchain, in the center here we have this B2Waste crypto parachain, and what that is that's a type of blockchain that is a part of a blockchain network. So we have our own blockchain tracking waste in the city, but it is part of a larger network. And why that is important is that basically how blockchains work is users send transactions, send information into the blockchain, and that is added as blocks of information into the blockchain. But in this particular case, what happens, users send their information to the blockchain, but that information is packaged up into a proposed block, which is sent to a much larger blockchain, which validates that information and says, okay, no one's trying to cheat, no one's trying to say they didn't produce waste or delete any information or spend money they don't have. And this larger blockchain validates the information and allows that to be added to our much smaller blockchain. And what this allows us to do is have our own private blockchain, but have the kind of security guarantees of a much larger blockchain. It also allows us to connect to other blockchains. So for example, we can send transactions to other blockchains and pay people in different cryptocurrencies or give them different blockchain rewards. So this has been a very quick overview of kind of a complex topic. So I hope you found it all interesting, and if you did, please feel free to get in touch. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the 2 minutes that you gave us. Any questions? I suspected that you were going to say something about this.
Hi, Ian. Thank you very much for the presentation. So, early research from Robert Cialdini shows that one of the main predictors of environmental behaviors is actually what others are doing. So the way I compare myself with others. I believe that blockchain has a huge potential in terms of bringing that up, of promoting that healthy social comparison that kind of moves us all. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is there anything that you've been doing with that?
Yeah, so that kind of comes under what we would consider gamification. And what it allows us to do is both provide information like how do I compare to my neighbors, and how does my neighborhood compare to other neighborhoods, right? And so hopefully we can kind of increase this idea of community spirit and people wanting to perform well so that their neighborhood performs well. And we can also kind of introduce rewards based upon, you know, the best performing neighborhood. And basically, we're just providing an information system on top of which we can kind of do these experiments and try and, you know, introduce these new approaches.
It's interesting. I had come across the PAIT, pay as you throw, and in discussions with colleagues, we realized that maybe, you know, in countries where people are a bit more relaxed, they wouldn't care so much to throw the bag into the container to just pay what they throw, and they would just put the bag on the side, you know, next to the container, rather than actually. So my question here, and I realize that this blockchain is far advanced in that, but tell me, what are the incentives? What is the incentive that, because, you know, everybody, and this for me is a principle of humankind, anything needs to be simple, easy, and generate benefit. So I like your idea of the incentives and trust, the two aspects that you highlighted, but how do you create incentive to actually, you know, go forward with this and deliver?
So this is definitely a fundamental problem, that if you create a payment for people to dispose waste, they have this sudden incentive to just basically throw that waste outside of the system, right? Illegally dump it, and that's really not something we want to create. So the alternative is where you're kind of more rewarding people for recycling. So it's more a benefit for recycling as opposed to a payment for producing waste. And you can also structure it as kind of, there's a payment for producing waste, but then the more of your waste you kind of put into the system, you kind of get money back or some sort of rebate to encourage people to be using the system properly. The second part of your question, sorry, was about the simplicity of the technology.
It was just the incentive. How do you create incentives in individuals and families? You know, not at the level of municipality, because municipality, of course, they trust and they want to believe that this technology will help them to resolve one of their major problems, which is waste management. But how do you get the individuals and the families to actually adhere? And you were talking about this payment for so people be paid for the waste they deliver, which reminds me the plastic bottles now and the glass bottles in which people take it to those machines, and it's working. And in that case, there's a benefit. It's easy because it's in the supermarket, so it's just next door. But what if, you know, can you do that for all kinds of waste? Can you get people to actually separate? Because that's not what has been happening in many places. So it's this issue, you know, it's a challenge. How do you get these people to actually do it?
So my background is an economist, so, you know, I like the idea of financial incentives. But I think realistically, when you talk to people in the waste management industry, they kind of correctly see that a big role has to be played by basically regulation and rules, saying that you have to use the system and kind of trying to set norms, even if that ends up as basically a payment, sort of a penalty if you don't use the system. If we're kind of setting the norm, this is the rule, you have to use these bags, that's kind of the way to try and encourage people, I think, at the end of the day. Because, you know, the financial incentives, sure, they're nice, but they don't always end up being, you know, a high enough incentive to encourage everyone to basically use the system.
Okay, well, yeah, please.
Hello. Thanks for your presentation. My question is, I don't know if I misunderstood, what's the mechanism to calculate, to weight the the different types of like recycling materials, or it's based on trust, as you said in the beginning of your presentation. And if, for example, it's a building or like a condominium that is the collection is for like different like housings is centralized in one like bin. So how will be this calculation?
That's a very important question, especially for the sort of Portuguese context, because some of the countries where they have quite advanced systems in this area, you have really individual houses with their own waste bins, and you can tell this waste came from this person. Whereas in a number of countries like Portugal, people more live in large apartment buildings where they share a waste deposit point, right? So one approach is that you're just measuring that building's waste from that entire building, and you don't know individually who in that building contributed to that. And so you have to provide kind of your incentives at a building level, right? The other approach is introducing more technology, where basically to each household, you're giving them different colored bags, and each of those bags has a QR code or an RFID that is read automatically, and we're basically able to track the production of an individual household of the different types of waste and recycling.
Thanks.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. I guess we will have more opportunities after with the discussion. So thank you very much, Ian, for your contribution. And now, mudar para português ou mantemos em inglês? Muito faz, não é? Se calhar para o Ian poder perceber é melhor mantermos em inglês. Okay, we'll keep in English so that you get included in the discussion. And both Pedro and Sergio are quite fluent as well, and maybe I could have done that from the beginning as well. But anyway, we'll carry on in English now. So next is Pedro Pinto. Pedro is a researcher at the Centro para a Inovação em Território, Urbanismo e Arquitetura, CITUA, which is one of the research centers at the Instituto Superior Técnico. And he will be speaking about the plan.
Pedro Pinto, certo?
The plan as history or plan as vision, and I'm translating, so I hope it will be okay. Testing the adherence of the plan to the reality of the metropolitan area of Lisbon through spatial analysis.
Muito obrigado, professor. Good afternoon. So, this is part of a research project. Part of a research first, this is a work conducted by me, Professor Isabel Lopa Ramos, and Professor Beatriz Condessa. And this is part of a research project financed by the FCT, Project MetroGov, which is studying the metropolitan governance in the metropolitan area of Lisbon within the CITUA Research Center. And it was presented originally at the Concur International Conference a couple of months ago. So the dynamics of the past 5 decades in the metropolitan area of Lisbon, as you might be well aware, have been one of dramatic change, both to the landscape and to the expansion of urban areas. In the left, you have the extent of urban cover in 1965. The contemporary regional plan of 1964 was expecting urban development to keep expanding slowly, but what actually happened until 2018 was that all this area in red has been converted to artificial land uses. So, looking at this, we pose the following questions. Are the first generation plans, we're talking about the municipal land use plans, prospective, or were they just legitimizing pre-existing unplanned urban areas developed during that period of rapid urban expansion? How much of that planned urban development was de facto urbanized since the plans were enacted? And whether the urban development occurred where planned. For this, we used two main data sources, which are the land cover maps published by the Direção-Geral de Território. We have those for 1995, which we consider contemporary to the first generation plans. And then we have the most recent ones from 2018, which are contemporary with the current period of revision, so the second generation plans. And then we also have the actual planned uses for the first and second generation plans, also in cartography produced by the DGT. So the timeline for the planning in Portugal started, the current framework started with the first generation of municipal land use plans, which started in 1982, but actually only took off after the 1990 legislation. And then the first generation was mostly developed during the 1990s. We have the regional land use plan from 2002. And then we had new legislation from 1999, which actually only produced effects a lot later. And we have the second generation starting mostly in the second half of the last decade. So looking at the land cover changes, one thing that's clearly visible is that agricultural land is the big loser of these past decades. It lost approximately 6% of its land area, of its surface. The forest and natural areas remain pretty much stable in total area, total surface, sorry about that. And the net gain was almost all absorbed by artificialized land. What's happening here? Okay. Looking at it more finely, you see that actually there's a lot of transference between agriculture and natural and forested areas. So areas such as former farmland that become scrubland. And in return, you have a transference between natural and forest areas that have become artificialized. So the only land use that has become a net gain in all categories is actually artificial land use. This corresponded with a period of almost constant population growth, but interestingly, it comes a couple of decades after the big spurt in growth in the metropolitan area. So we had a huge housing problem, then we had a huge growth, and now we're kind of matching both. The triangle on the left, the pyramid on the left, shows the higher up you are. This isn't working well. The higher up you are on the pyramid, it's the percentage of artificialized land. And as you can see, you have municipalities within the metropolitan area that have close to 80% artificial land, Lisbon, of course, but also Amadora with 70%. But you also have municipalities such as Vila Franca de Xira or Alcochete that have very little artificialized areas. You have, for instance, Vila Franca de Xira has close to 70% agricultural land, and you have municipalities like Sesimbra with close to 80% forest and natural areas. So this is not a fully artificialized metropolitan area by any means. But you do have a dynamic of change from non-artificial to artificial land uses that sees close to 20% of the territory being artificialized in this interval between 1995 and 2018 in municipalities like Oeiras and Amadora. And an interesting thing you have is that you have the planned urban areas from the first generation plans. 54% of those were already artificialized. You had 14% of the actually prescribed urban areas being artificialized since then, but you still have 32% of the so-called expansion areas that are still left to be urbanized. And of course, this means that you've actually been artificializing land outside the allotted urban perimeters. And what you can see is that out of the new artificial areas, the blue ones, which are, for instance, here and here, are within protected areas. This shouldn't be happening, so something went wrong. Then you have new artificial areas in rural place outside protected areas. That's 37.1% of the new artificial areas. And then you have the ones that actually are being artificialized where they were supposed to be artificialized. That's 59.1%, but there's still 40% that are missing the target. The second generation plans have been promoted as a way of sorting these issues with the first generation plans. In part they are. That's the good news. The bad news is that they actually overwhelmingly underestimate the farmland. So you have a lot of farmland, and this is actual land cover, being mapped in 2016 and published in 2018. And the plans underestimated by 6.7%. And yes, a lot of that is because it was planned as forest and natural areas, but you have a lot of those areas that are actually not non-built up areas that are being composed as new extensions to the urban perimeters, which is worrying. So concluding, we had, and this is common knowledge, we had urban perimeters that were vastly overestimated in the first generation plans. Only 13% of the expansion areas have been implemented since then. You have this problem with new artificialized land in rural areas where you weren't supposed to be artificializing, and especially within nature protection areas. And then you have the partial good news that the second generation plans do show a lot of constraint in setting up new expansion areas, especially when you compare to the planned expansions of close to 49% of the urban perimeters from the first generation plans. And that's it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. And thank you also for meeting the time. So do we have any questions already for Pedro? Okay, Sergio.
Hi, Pedro. Thank you for the presentation. I'm sure that this is a little bit outside your area, but I'm curious with what can promote the adherence to these plans. I live in Vilafranca, and I'm quite aware of the rural area, and I keep talking with my friends with the pricing of the houses in Lisbon and in Vilafranca increasing over time. We all talk about this idea that buying a rural spot, it's like it's golden. It's good. It's a good investment, and it's probably the only way out for you to have your own dream house, family house, and so. I'm just thinking about if you have any clues about what can promote the adherence to these plans and the consciousness of the communities about these plans and the importance of these plans.
Well, there's one thing that's absolutely evident, which is enforcement. Since the first generation plans, well, not since the first generation plans, but since people were expecting to do second generation plans, that the concept was, if an expansion area cannot still be justified according to current urban dynamics, then it should be excluded and reverted back to rustic areas, so rural areas, non-buildable areas. And there are very few instances across the whole country where that actually has been implemented effectively. It's a lack of political courage and a lot of whole lot of lack of oversight, a lot of, yeah. So you have the central administration entities that are extremely adamant about not allowing people to change the limits of the protection area around the creek or whatever 1 meter to the left because it was poorly mapped out 30 years ago. But at the same time, when they're presented with the revision of, with the second generation plan, they just put their visa over anything, including keeping all the expansion areas that were a relic from the first generation plans. That would sort like 90% of the problems. As for the creation of housing, it depends. If you're in an urban environment, you should have urban housing politics at the municipal, but also at the intermunicipal level. That would be extremely relevant in a metropolitan area such as Lisbon, because you have housing problems all over, but they're much more acute in some municipalities. And you have a lot of pockets of availability in other municipalities. If you had an intermunicipal policy where you would provide housing, not necessarily in the municipality that is lacking housing, but next door, that would be an excellent start. You had that with the transportation system. It took only one political decision to sort the issue of the incompatibility of municipal networks, and you had the pass that would work for one system, not the other. They sorted it out in 6 months. So it can be done, but it's political will.
It's also the municipal financial system that needs to be revised for that things to happen.
Yes,
otherwise
taxation
they
and
will
so on.
not share taxes, I can tell you. Okay, thank you, Pedro. Thank you very much. Sergio, so we have now the last but not least presentation, Sérgio Moreira, from the Centro de Investigação em Ciência Psicológica. His presentation will be about fallacies of the human behavior that compromise sustainability of projects that are induced by development. I'm very curious.
Let me see if I can.
Will you speak in English or in Portuguese?
I will speak in English.
Okay.
Pode maximizar só. Thank you very much. So this is the slides are in Portuguese. I will speak in English. My name is Sergio. I'm a social psychologist from the University of Lisbon and from Católica Lisbon Business School of Economics. I'm also a consultant, so I live between two worlds, the academia and the world of consultancy, which I actually like a lot, and where I've met Maria several times in other forums of impact assessment discussions. And actually, this idea of the fallacies about human behavior, they came from this discussion between me and the close friends of Maria Partidário, which is Ana Maria Esteves and Frank van Clay. So, so one of the things that I do the most is to engage communities. Engage communities in new project developments. The last project that I had was a project with Somincor, Neves Corvo, a mining site in the south of Portugal. And so in this project we did a triangulation study where basically there was very little knowledge from the company about the communities. And when we entered, we decided to get in touch with the communities and collect some data using surveys, also doing interviews to local leaders, and at the same time also looking at socioeconomic information and map that out and come with an idea of what were the perceptions of the communities about the acceptability. So this is what engagement is about. It's just bringing the knowledge of the communities into the table of business and help the CEOs, whoever, make the decisions to use that information properly in a way that it's healthy for everyone, for business and communities. So that's what I've been doing for many years now, actually. And one of the things that I keep seeing and listening in these projects is these CEOs and these people in top places, the people that make the decisions, they have these conceptions about human behavior that are so wrong. And they're consistent. So when I listened to this the first time, I would smile and say, oh, yeah, of course. And I was thinking, this guy's kind of crazy, right? And then I listened to it again and again and again, and it's like, it's almost 20 years, I don't want to admit that, but it's almost 20 years doing consultancy. From a junior position, now more an independent, more senior position. And it's so consistent, these fallacies, these ideas about the human behaviors that influence the way people do engagement, relate with people. And that can be related with if people adhere or not to new technology for a window, or if people adhere or not to a new technology for reusable buildings, or if people adhere or not to recycling properly things at home. These fallacies, they can influence the quality of the decisions and the sustainability of the projects. And these are the ones that I want to talk to you about today. So I divided in two parts. One has to do with human judgments, and it's about being irrational, rational, and the other one has to do with social relationships. It's about being antisocial or social. And so about being rational, so the first thing that I keep listening is that people's opinion are subjective. That people, it's not based in facts, okay? The other fallacy is that people are irrational. It's the idea that people don't know what's better for them, okay? Another fallacy that's related, it's the idea that human behavior is unpredictable. One day people say one thing, the other day people say another thing that's different. In the project that I was working with, EDP, it's a replacement project, so people would be moving from one place to the other because of the flooding of a village. In the negotiation process, there was this family, head of a family, a guy, that agreed with EDP about the compensation, and then he went home, and then the other day he said that he wouldn't agree no more. And this is the kind of thing that people believe that it's inconsistent, unpredictability, okay? And the last one has to do with ingenuity, which kind of links the three things. Because people are subjective and irrational and inconsistent, people need to be taught better. People need to be informed about the facts. And I keep listening to this idea that people need to be informed. Actually, this is like the first thing that when people have a problem in a project, they say, let's inform, let's communicate with people, let's tell them, let's teach them. Why do I think that these things are fallacies? They are not necessarily fallacies in a way that they are completely wrong. We can be quite irrational, like a smoker saying, oh no, this is not that bad for health, this is only bad for other people. We can be quite irrational in that sense. But it's not like the irrationality that it's close to calling someone, yeah, people are kind of crazy. We can't understand people. We can understand people. So the first thing is, yeah, so people can have subjective opinions, but the thing is that they are important for them. Perception is reality. And proponents keep missing this idea. The other one has to do with irrationality. Yeah, sure, people are irrational, but errors that come from poor rationality, poor capacity of judgment are systematic. The bias are systematic. For instance, thinking about environmental impacts, it's very complex because the impacts are spread in time, they are spread geographically, and they are spread across people. It's not like, for instance, the risks for health and environmental risks are completely different in this sense. Smoking is something that someone is doing by his own choice in an exact moment, in a behavior. You can point to it and you can point to the consequences. But with environment, everything is like spread apart. So it's very difficult to think rationally about environmental impacts, for instance. Yeah, unpredictability, sure. The behaviors are determined by multiple causes. It's not just one. This guy was negotiating the compensation in a meeting, and then he go home and he's with his family, and the wife says, "Are you kidding me? This is family. This is the house for my mother. This worth the double." So the context change, of course, that the way that people behave and things changes. And information, well, the idea that informing people is like the sacred grail, it's not. People will only learn if they have the capacity and the motivation. So it's not like fallacies in terms that it's completely erroneous, but it's fallacies in the sense that it's not rooted to what we know about human perception. So yeah, I have another list of fallacies I can talk to you about. I will move quickly through them because I want to show you two other things. So this has to do with people being self-centered, with people being aggressive, not proportional in their reactions, about people being very rigid, someone that is mind fixed, it's very difficult to change. And the other one has to do with people being greedy. And, well, people lack this notion that we belong to social groups, that we want to protect the social groups that we belong to, and that it's completely natural that we're a little bit biased, right? Portugal played much better than Belgium, right? That's what Portuguese people say, right? But Belgians would say, yeah, we defended much better than Portugal, right? So yeah, so we tend to protect our own social groups, and that's natural. It's not like crazy irrational. It's not like out of this world. Yeah, and the idea that people are rigid, actually that's quite a mistake. Development projects promote this discourse about the we and the they, about the proponents and the communities, and this is what creates rigidity, is that the social context is always the same. It's the proponent and the communities, the proponent, the communities. Yeah, of course, if you promote that social comparison, that social distinction, of course that people will always be in a defensive or offensive position, depending on their stake about the project. Yeah, so subjectivity, rationality, and predictability, ingenuity, and on and on and on. These are the fallacies that I believe that promote the four scenes of the relationship between proponents and communities. And the scenes are a confusion between communication and information. Okay, communicating, it's completely different from informing, and proponents keep believing that information is the holy grail to solve all the project problems. A promotion of this discourse of the we and the they. Projects can be seen as a problem for both, a problem or as an asset for both communities and proponents. They can be the same group, the stakeholders altogether. Aversion to complexity. People run away from complexity. From people that both agree and disagree with the project, that like and dislike a project. We need to embrace complexity, not run away from it. And individualizing things that are social in nature. This idea that, hey, this guy is crazy, he's reacting very badly about the changes of the river, in a river, for instance. And it's not about the changes in the river, it's because he's a fisherman, and that's where he goes with his friends that are also fishermen. And part of his identity has to do with being fishermen. It's not the individual, it's the group that is being affected. Well, taking this into consideration can improve social acceptance of a project, the quality of the decisions, and optimizing the results, increasing the positive impacts and mitigating the negative impacts in the project. Willing to discuss this?
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. I was actually just stopping the time here. So very good questions, even though a bit, I feel a bit uncomfortable with, I have recognized everything that you say, but it's rather uncomfortable. So any question to Sergio? This allows, in fact, very interesting connections to the other presentations, not only in relation to the choices that people make in relation to waste, And how do you plan such things with such an unstable kind of behavior, unless people benefit, and that's where you can actually more or less control what they're going to how they're going to react, or in relation to the modular houses as well. The plan. Is the plan, how do you adhere to a plan? Is the plan something to tell you what's going to happen, or a plan to give direction to where you want to go? That could also be something to connect. So any questions or comments? Or the choice about the windows. Are we going to have these windows, open these windows, or not? Is it worth the investment? So, Ian.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed a lot of the presentation. So, you talked a lot about sort of CEOs of big companies that are having these problems and these misconceptions. Us in sort of academia also have this role of communication and providing information, which we don't always do so well. What is your kind of advice for what needs to change more in the academic space of trying to communicate our projects to communities that we want to change and we want to see?
Yeah, I see communication as a very intimate process, and people think about communication as something that it's very unidirectional. And I understand that. So, for instance, you study so many hours, invest so many hours in being an expert in your topic, and an engineer invests so many hours, so much time in coming up with the best plan for a dam construction, for instance. And I can see that. When you bring that to people, you should approach communication as a very intimate process. You are going inside the person's mind, and you should let the person get inside your own mind as well. And from my perspective, that's what's missing. It's the confusion between information and communication. So it's the whole attitude. Instead of coming up with a project completed, it's going with a plan, with an idea, and asking people, and being open to change. No one, if someone at your home come up with an idea, but it's closed, it's unlikely that you will accept it promptly unless it gives you a lot of benefits, all right? But if the benefits are not immediate, then maybe discussing the idea and giving it a little bit of time to boil, and then returning again with improvements, with changes. And that's the way I see it. Does it make sense?
Yes, very much.
Good. Maybe can we open now for everyone, now that you had your hot question? Do you want to sit here? Do you want to stay there? Because after all, there's not many more here than the presenters. So if you just want to, you do whatever you want. If you want to join me here, that's fine. If you want to stay there, fine. But let's now open a bit the discussion, okay? And bring together these various issues, the technology and how the technology is prepared to contemplate also what are aspirations and ambitions, also from the community, to what extent the windows, the sustainable windows, are actually asking the community if they're okay with them and if it's going to be feasible. This is not only about polymers, it's also about people using them. So that could be an interesting interaction here. Also in relation to the plan and the modular buildings and of course the waste. And I think I felt immediately that there was a strong connection between the two of you, also because of the behavior part. But we had so many interesting aspects here that it's good to at least use a few more minutes. It's 5:15. We can use another 5 minutes to discuss a bit. So, you were going to say something. Sergio, you sit wherever you want. We can sit here.
I guess I had a quick follow-up question, that whether you think that we are relying too much on kind of quantitative data where we send a very fixed survey that says, how do you rate this on a scale of 1 to 7 versus a more interview approach, more qualitative approach to kind of gathering input from the community.
Yeah, so I'm not completely sure if I got the question, but tell me if I'm missing the point. So again, returning to communication very quickly, just to say that approaching someone, it's important if you know something in advance. If you know what's the empty spots that you need to fill in, and what are the conceptions that are already okay and that you can just reinforce and move quickly. So I'm a heavy advocate of database decision making, right? So this doesn't have to do with just feeling the pulse of the communities. It's always based on data, and qualitative data, quantitative data, it doesn't have any difference. It all depends in how rigorous you do the data collection and the data analysis, and how good that data is in relation to your research questions, to the questions that you have, that you need to be solved, right? And so, yeah, for instance, in developing a project which involves quantitative surveying and qualitative interviews, and each one of these elements of these projects, of the triangle, each one of these elements was meant to answer a specific question, okay? And that's what we wanted to address. For instance, with the survey, we wanted to address social license to operate and the main predictors of the social license to operate. And that's the kind of thing that we did. We used scales, we went door to door, we asked people to fill in the survey, and then we did multiple hierarchical linear regressions to find out what would come out. For instance, with the interviews, we did qualitative thematic content data analysis of a set of interviews to mayors and journal directors, for instance, and come up with the main themes that people would address. And we found out that there was like a huge gender gap in that region that needed to be solved, the women in that region, the professional layer of the women's was completely depleted because of the huge salaries that the mine is paying to the man, and because that's like mainly a male profession. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So this side can speak as well. Even though the microphone is over there, she can very quickly reach you. If you want to speak in Português, também posso traduzir, não tem problema. Não se inibam por estarmos em inglês, ou enfim, só estamos em inglês para o Ian poder participar. Ian, by the way, did you follow well, Manuela, did you follow well Manuela's presentation on the sustainable windows?
I did a bit because it was quite visual and had some English.
Yeah, okay. And then the modular as well.
A lot of presentations in
Okay.
English, so.
Right.
Yeah, we could have a house like Professor proposed, with windows like you proposed, and with a recycle process like Ian proposed. And we could use psychology instruments to promote this, right?
No, and then we could see to what extent that actually captures the interest of the market.
Yep.
And there is a lot. There are a lot of modular houses these days. You know, even my brother has got a business on that. So when I was hearing you, and I was just, thinking about the innovative part of all of that, because that's already in the market. So, and there's a lot of issues regarding the modular houses as well. And it's not only about waste and reuse or the costs involved with that. It's got to do with, with issues even of location and permissions and all of it. And there's been a lot of conflicts on that, because the first perception was that this could be placed anywhere, but in fact it isn't.
Yeah.
And there's all the other connections, just the fact that you need to have the whole infrastructure there.
Yeah.
Then you're not going to move it just like that if it was a camping site or a tent. So yeah, but I mean, it's interesting, especially the concern about the reuse of the materials. I think that's a very important aspect that we need to pay attention to. Ian?
I guess I would have a question for the other panelists, which, you know, I'm kind of new to this area, cities, but it's important we all live in cities, or increasingly so. I was just interested if people had the impression that in different areas, if there was kind of an acceleration of the application of science and technology development more recently than potentially in the past, if they thought that that was true.
Once you started having the satellite imagery and you could digitize it to create new layers of information with a level of detail that really was unthinkable 3 decades ago. So now you're planning, and this is a problem, an interesting and a good problem, but now you have the problem that you're planning theoretically at the 1 to 25,000 scale. But in practice, you're actually doing detailed plans at the scale of an entire municipality or an entire region. Because the entities that are going to check if you're, well, they're doing all the checks to see if you're fulfilling all the needs, the requirements, and so on. They're going to zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, zoom in. Oh! This is 5 meters to the left of where it should be. So it's 1 to 25,000 in name only. So it's a good problem because now we can actually have that problem. But in the past, you did 1 to 25,000 over 1 to 25,000 maps. That's no longer the case. But it's been a huge leap forward.
That actually connects to the data. And the availability of data and what people actually know, because now there's more data. So the issue isn't becoming not so much what you do with data, it's how do you interpret it and how you actually analyze data, what it means, and what are the things that you can do and change to get things better. Which brings us to our topic, you know, urban science to create cities for the future. And we have here a combination of different aspects from technology, which is already out there as well, at least from Manuela's words, not in Portugal but elsewhere. The modular buildings, which are out there in the market, and you can see them in 125 Road in the Algarve. It's full of these places that sell these modular houses, not with the recycled material, but of course. The waste and how we're going to deal with the waste and the innovative ways of getting people to actually take advantage of the waste, because it is a market already as well, but also to reduce and enable and be incentivized to recycle. The plan and how we actually plan and make sure that the plan is not necessarily followed, but it's believed and is trusted. And that's where we can also talk about incentivation and trust in relation to what the plan plans. And it's not only about detail, it's about strategy as well. And of course the behavior and the attitudes and what in fact describes and how people react. And what Sergio was talking about, it's about reality of human behavior. So even though we can sometimes pretend that technology and data is going to solve everything, it always comes down to behavior. Yep. So, all right. Well, I guess that it's time to close because it's 5 minutes to 5:30. I don't want to prevent you from attending the final session. And I'd like to thank again to all speakers, which are at this moment, except for the two of you, thank you very much for being here with us. Because other than them that have been speaking and me moderating, which makes the minimum of the people that needs to be in the room, there's only you two and of course the assistants, the support staff, and thank you very much also for your presence. And enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you,
Maria. Very much.
Great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you, Sergio. Bye-bye.